I got to tell you, the reason why I wanted to do this is because I've been working on the Cambrian off and on for a few years. When I worked for West Bay Exploration, I spent a lot of time looking at cores, not necessarily this one, but a lot of other cores, sediments, geophysical logs, chip samples, all kinds of stuff, trying to understand the sediments. Of course, the number one problem that we've had, and I think Al Phillips alluded to it, there wasn't a lot of good information out there to tell us how to correlate these rocks, what they are exactly, where they came from, and there's a lot of disjointed information, right? So I wanted to kind of simplify everything and present to you today a very simplistic geological explanation, what I think these rocks are all about. Unfortunately, I have kept some of the old nomenclature, like Eau Claire and Mount Simon, which comes from the Michigan Basin side of things, but I think you guys can handle that. Okay, so before we get going with the core, I'm going to step back in time. We're going to talk about what was going on during the Cambrian. How did we get these rocks in the first place? Okay, so the Cambrian, with respect to southwestern Ontario and North America at large, started at 539 million years ago and went on to about 485 million years ago. This was followed by the Middle Ordovician period, and that went on to 440 million years ago. Now, the Sauk Transgression was a very significant sea level rise over the continent of Laurentia, and that was responsible for the deposition of sandstones, sandy limestones, and limestones. Now, all those limestones have been converted into dolomite since then, but that's what gave rise to these rocks in front of you today. Now, the Sauk Transgression was caused by a thermal subsidence following the breakup of the supercontinent Rodinia and Pannotia. More importantly, it followed the ending of the Ediacaran Ice Age. Now, this is a snapshot of the continent of Laurentia in North America with Siberia and Baltica following the breakup of the supercontinent. And these continents were just starting to move to the north, up towards the equator. This is a close-up of Laurentia during that early breakup of the supercontinents, about 540 million years ago. And the continents here were all moving north. This is a shot of Laurentia or North America at about 500 million years ago during late Cambrian, as it already moved north to the equator and started to move to the east. Now here we see those continents, Laurentia, Siberia, Baltica, and the supercontinent Gondwana at about 514 million years ago, or late Cambrian, and they're positioned within the extensive Penthalastic and Iapetus oceans. Now you can see here the continents of Siberia and Laurentia were going to be inundated by these easterly trade winds, which would have been responsible for these very large storm tracks that would have been very influential in the deposition of these sediments that we're talking about today. Now, the Sauk Transgression was responsible for the flooding of the Appalachian and Michigan basins, resulting in the deposition of these sediments during the Cambrian. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in today's core workshop. Just to give you some background, the Cambrian period is under a lot of study today. All these age boundaries are being proposed for various stratigraphic units in the Cambrian, and these are going to be formally defined and ratified by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. And here we are today trying to get a handle on the Cambrian in southwestern Ontario. And that was really my goal the whole time. I just wanted to see if I could identify the sediments, can I understand the cycles of sedimentation, and can I correlate this over a large distance? Okay, here we have a snapshot of a continental shelf. Now this continental shelf was formed along a passive continental margin that took place during the Cambrian on the eastern side of the Laurentian continent. Now, this kind of a continental shelf setup would have existed on both the eastern side of Laurentia as well as the western side. Now, here's a snapshot of, again, the passive margin. Here we have the carbonate shelf extending out into the deeper waters, out towards an island arc chain. Now, I don't have a picture showing the island arc chain here. I just got the words. But this island arc chain would have formed because of the subduction of oceanic crust underneath another oceanic plate along a convergent plate boundary. Now, eventually, the continent of Laurentia would collide with this island arc chain, and that marks the beginning of the Appalachian Mountains during the tectonic orogeny, but we're not talking about that today. Now, here is the paleogeography of the Cambrian for the continent of Laurentia. A transcontinental arch existed from Arizona and went all the way northeast up into Canada, splitting the continent into two pieces. We have the eastern side of Laurentia and the western side. Basically, the passive continental margin it was similar on both sides. So we're going to see that there's similar rocks on both sides of the continent. Here we have a depiction of the sandstones that would align, well, southwestern Ontario in particular. And then we have the deeper water limestones and the deepest water shales as you move out towards the outer reaches of the carbonate shelf. Now today, the Cambrian butts up against this Algonquin Arch, where we see the Cambrian sediments are absent. This map is a compilation of work that was done by, I believe, Terry Carter in the library way back when. We've used this visual before, and basically it's the limits for the Eau Claire, Mount Simon, and Trompe-l'Eau in Ontario. We've also got on here the oil and gas pools, key Cambrian wells all the way around the arch. And of course, what we're focusing on today is this core from T012159. Now, I have to tell you guys this, it's a big caveat here. The OPDS, unfortunately, is not consistent. So we have the relative thicknesses of these Cambrian rocks are probably okay, but for the most part, you can't bank on the formation tops. What I've discovered through my many years of work as a geologist at the library is that, unfortunately, the Form 7s are very inconsistent. We've had many different geologists working on these sort of things and reporting tops, and they're just not consistent. And no one has actually homogenized the system for us. So maybe in the future, we can look to do something like that. Okay, so we're going to get to the core. Here we are, the core. Core comes from this well. It's the Dundee East well, Lake Erie 45E4C. Permit number 12159. It was a strat test abandoned. There was gas shows reported in the Shadow Lake in Eau Claire, and I think Alan Phillips may have mentioned something about that. It was drilled by Dundee Corporation. I believe I know them by Dundee Energy LLP, but this is what's in the Form 7. Dundee Corporation? Oh, there you go, okay. It was drilled and complete in September 2012, and a plug and abandoned in July of 2018. This is the core 1130 out in front of you. Now, we're not going to look at all of it. But we're going to look at the most important part, which is mostly from the top of the Middle Ordovician and then the Cambrian sediments down towards the Precambrian basement. Okay, so why did these guys drill this well in the first place? Here we have a bathymetric map of the bottom of Lake Erie. And you can see quite clearly here, they have a very prominent structural high here identified. Dundee Energy shot a big 3D in 2012 over the Nanticoke Shoal. And I think Al Phillips was the guy who probably directed this. And they drilled this well, offsetting the other Mitchell well, T012159. Now, the reason why they did this is because they saw this prominent structural feature in the lake, and they figured it reflected structural high in the Paleozoic rocks below. No, and they were right. But they're also looking for gas, and they were also looking for gas storage. And you can see it's in a great location because it's located just south of Nanticoke, where Imperial Oil and Stelco have their industrial operations. Okay, so my whole goal in studying the Cambrian was to try to understand the sediments. Because again, previous researchers really kind of made it complicated. So what I ended up doing is looking at the fact that this is a transgressive sequence. And the transgressive sequence is highlighted here. We have, coarser grain materials like medium and coarse grain sands sitting on an old land surface that grades upwards into a very finely crystalline or macritic limestone. Now, this is what you're going to see in the Eau Claire and even in the Mount Simon, more so in the Eau Claire Formation. Now, I did this because I needed to be able to recognize cycles of sedimentation that I could use to correlate over large distances. And this is kind of important because we need to know where these rocks are and can we correlate them? Can we assess their geology in a consistent fashion? So the ways I did this, and the only way I got to doing this in the first place was I ended up studying a lot of different cores, like Clairville, near Willie, North Shore Lake Erie, and I described all these cores using lithologs. This is an example of a litholog for the 12159 well. I'll go through this very briefly. And also, one of the key things I did was I also made sure I could correlate the lithologies that I was seeing with their gamma ray and sometimes gamma ray neutron log signatures. Because the only way you're going to correlate these units, you have to be able to recognize them on logs where you don't have core. So on the left, we have my formation tops or my unit boundaries. I've got the litholog itself, which is basically, it's a grain size lithology indicator. I've got all kinds of descriptions on here for the various features that are present. I got the permeability and porosity marked on here in this middle tract. And then I got my chicken scratch over on the right, kind of describes what you're looking at in the sediments. Now what I'm showing here in this red box is a very large transgressive sequence. So you can see at the bottom of what I call Eau Claire 3, we have fine and medium grained sandstones grading up to this very finely crystalline, today, a dolomite. So we see a very large transgressive sequence that we can actually map and correlate across large areas, right? But of course, the Eau Claire 3, like all the units that I've identified, are actually made up of cycles of sedimentation that are cyclical. And for example, I put this up against the gamma ray signature here for Eau Claire 3 from the well. And you can see we got these high gamma sands going to these low gamma carbonates. And these things go cyclic all the way up. The most important thing is, after looking at the cores over and over, you kind of recognize, and looking at the logs, you start to recognize sedimentary units. And I'm actually showing you, this is one of the more difficult ones to show. So if it actually passes the acid test here, we can do this over and over for the easier ones. So we can recognize these finding upward sequences over and over in the Eau Claire, all the way down to Eau Claire 1. We have a basal marker here, and it's logged in the core. This is a transgressive event that actually separates the Eau Claire formation from the Mount Simon, which is really kind of cool, because once you can recognize that in core and on logs, you got yourself a marker which you can now separate these two formations and correlate them over a large distance. So this is the Mount Simon Unit 5. This is you can see the Mount Simon up here. It's got a lot more dolomite in it. But as you go down through the Mount Simon, it's actually very, very sandy. But again, we have these finding upward sequences that can be recognized. And I put that up against the gamma ray log signature here again and get these higher gamma sands with these lower gamma dolomites. And again, cyclical, very cyclical in nature. There's that transgressive surface that I spoke about. And this is repetitive all the way down. So Mount Simon 3, even though it's becoming much more sandy here, you can see finding upwards transgressive type sequences. So the Sauk Transgression had remarkably many cycles of finding upwards, but this core demonstrates that it was more common than not. All the way down to Mount Simon 1. Mount Simon 1, which is the last bit of rock in that core that we brought. Again, finding upward sequences that are highly recognizable, sitting on top of what I call the lower Mount Simon unit sandstones. This is a solid sandstone unit. It's basically medium and coarse grained sands, and there's no carbonates at all. And that sits unconformably upon the Precambrian basement. Now, what I wanted to do at this point is to go over the geophysical logs with you for this core section. And again, once you got everything annotated, you got your shadow lake, you got the unconformity at the shadow lake, the unconformity between the Middle Ordovician and the Cambrian, and you find your transgressive surface, you put in all your tops for your Eau Claire and your Mount Simon. What we're looking at here is the gamma ray log signature on the left. I've got porosity highlighted in orange here in the porosity track. And over here on the right, this is the resistivity. I think Al mentioned that there was gas show in this well, and it was reported between 1007 and 1026, all the way down to the top of the Eau Claire number 1 unit. Below that, the induction log does look very wet. So I wanted to put a little comment in here about carbon capture, just for, entertain Dick a little bit. If you take a look at the deep saline aquifer that we consider for this well, if you were to consider it, you got about 230 feet of what looks to be porous and wet sediments. And then, of course, you have this gas cap sitting on top, or it's not really a gas cap, it's just gas-saturated rock with a whole bunch of water in it. That would expand your deep saline aquifer to about 300 feet thick. However, for carbon capture purposes, gas-occupied pore space is overall a reduction in the overall storage volume, and gas compressibility does become a factor. But if you listen to the geothermal talk earlier, he's actually said that the gas compressibility is actually a benefit. You can actually get more CO2 in there if you had to. Now, I'm not suggesting that this well would be classified as a good candidate for CO2 sequestration. This is just because I wanted to show why this core is very important, because carbon capture and storage is going to become important here in Ontario shortly. Now I wanted to give you a close-up of this because I wanted to show you again, like once you annotate your log with all your, your unconformities or transgressive event that you can identify between the Eau Claire and the Mount Simon, you have the ability now to take this and start correlating with other wells that don't have core but have decent logs. And that's basically what I'm going to show you soon. But before I get to that, Baker Hughes did do a stochastic petrophysical analysis for these logs. And I'll run through this very briefly, very quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's hard to see the gamma ray signature, but it's in light green here. This is your induction log in this tract. We've got the porosity crossover, density neutron crossover here. We've got the net gross porosity calculation here. We're not going to talk about that at all. That's kind of like taking your effective porosity, dividing it by your crossover porosity. We're not going to worry about that. The most important part of this model is over on the right. We'll start with this tract here. This is the fluid saturation / gas and everything, hydrocarbon saturation in the hole. What we see here is from hydrocarbon saturation, it goes from 0 on the left to 100% on the right. And for water, it would be 0 on the right and 100% on the left. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at hydrocarbon saturation is better than 50%, highlighted in gray. And that corresponds well with the gas show that was reported for this well where they were drilling. Below that, of course, dominantly a water-saturated rock, which kind of fits the overall observation for this well. We're going to jump across to the right-hand side. This is the lithology of the rocks as presented by the geophysics. Over on the right, we've got 0%, over to the left, 100% of the lithology that's been used in this stochastic model. In white, we have the effective porosity. In light blue is limestone content, dark blue is dolomite, yellow is the sandstone, and the gray is the shale fraction. All of these parameters are used to calculate the stochastic petrophysical analysis, which we're going to talk about in this middle tract. So the effective porosity would be this dark line that borders a dark green band here. And you can see that is showing we have higher hydrocarbon saturation compared to water down to the top of the Eau Claire, which fits very well with the observations from drilling. And then below that, in light blue, we have the water saturation or movable water. And you can see that dominates the rest of the core. The most important part of this whole thing is these darn things over here. This is your pay flags. If you were drilling an oil and gas well, what you would want to do is use pay flags to help you complete your well. So where do I punch holes in my casing to get out the oil or the gas or whatever I'm looking for? So in a typical oil and gas well, you run casing, you cement, and then you perforate. And these pay flags will help identify those zones of interest. Now, how do we get those pay flags? You got to know something about your rocks. You got to know quite a bit about your rocks. And I'm going to tell you now, I had to go back to the core analysis in detail to be able to get a good feel of what parameters I should be using to generate this and to have something meaningful come out of my pay flags. So believe it or not, in this model that I'm showing you right now, this is a 1 millidarcy cutoff for the permeability. Now, 1 millidarcy cutoff doesn't sound like very much, does it? But you do have some opportunity there to move something into that wellbore. That results in a 10% cutoff for the entire Eau Claire formation. So in other words, you have to have more than 10% porosity in the Eau Claire before you have anything that's going to move from the formation into the wellbore. And that equated to about a 4% cutoff for the Mount Simon. Well, I mean, very quickly you see for the Eau Claire, it's dominated by dolomites. You can kind of see the, rock-water interactions would have closed off these pore throats a lot more easier in a dolomite than it would in a sandstone. So why is this important? Well, we don't core every well. We don't have cores for every well, but we do have logs. So if you have a model that you can use or rely upon for the inputs, you can actually create stochastic petrophysical analyses for those wells that don't have cores. And I have provided you with the reservoir parameter summaries, and you can take a look at those at your leisure. Okay, here's our well over here. I wanted to take what I learned from the lithologies that I saw in the core and the petrophysical logs, the log analysis, and I wanted to see if I can correlate anything over here with these wells offshore Lake Erie. And the reason for doing this is, we want to be able to take something from a known and apply it to the unknown and see if we can't start correlating. And what can we learn from these correlations? And so this 4-well transect here, I've done stratigraphic and structural cross sections across here to see what we can learn about the Cambrian sediments and what controlled their deposition in the first place. So what I have here is a fully annotated cross section. It's a stratigraphic cross section hung on the Shadow Lake Shale. Again, I've got your porosity highlighted in orange, gas and water shows highlighted here. This came from a DST from this well that did produce gas. Okay, so why did we do a stratigraphic cross-section? We do a stratigraphic cross-section to learn something about the stratigraphy. Well, there's a couple things you're going to notice right away. This well in the middle here, the 10043, looks like the Eau Claire and the Mount Simon is a whole lot thicker than the wells to the immediate left and right, to the west and east. And there's got to be some reasons for that. And what we end up finding out is there's a lot of structural controls that are actually controlling the deposition and thickness of these rocks in this area. On the left side, you see that these two are not correlating properly. Like this is a long depositional strike kind of cross-section. We should see these things kind of correlating well together. We got rocks that are supposed to be dipping in all these different directions. So you know there's a structural component to this, right? Affecting their deposition. So here is a structural cross-section hung on a structural datum. And let's go back to the middle again. Again, we're seeing that the rocks here, the Eau Claire and the Mount Simon, are quite thick. And they're quite offset from these two wells over here. Both of these wells were drilled on horst blocks. And what we find is that the horst blocks in the Cambrian are all sitting on pre-existing basement highs in the Precambrian basement. And it gave rise to, like the pre-existing basement highs gave rise to normal faulting that led to the development of horst blocks later in its structural history. We also noticed that these rocks aren't going to line up very well over here, so we are definitely putting a fault in here. So yes, we confirmed that these guys drilled this. This was a gas well, and that's the reason why they drilled it onto this horst block. Well, the same thing was done over here, except they didn't find any gas for that matter. Now, from an oil and gas perspective, they want to identify horst blocks because that's traps. These are fundamental for finding traps. Maybe for carbon capture, though, you want something like this guy. If we knew that we had a wide open graben, as depicted here, and we have a deep saline aquifer that was of reasonable porosity, permeability, and storage capacity, you would have yourself a candidate for carbon capture and storage, possibly. Possibly. Okay, so this is some of the other work I did for Geofirma. I took a look at some wells just to the northeast of our cord well over here. And again, along depositional strike, these three wells going basically east-west. And again, you're thinking, well, I probably won't see a whole lot, I won't learn a whole bunch about what's going on in here. Well, guess what? Complete surprise. Again, we're seeing in this middle well, the 1375 well, we have incredible thickening in the Eau Claire and the Mount Simon. Over to the right, this other well shows a very dramatic thinning in the Eau Claire and a complete absence of the Mount Simon. We're sitting on Precambrian basement here. We do see that, there's some correlation between these two using the stratigraphic cross-section, but there's more to the story than meets the eye. So we do our structural cross-section, we hang it on a structural datum, and then you start trying to correlate your rocks, according to depositional strike, they should be pretty flat. And of course, now you're putting in faults where you need them because these rocks are all offset from each other. And of course, this is sitting on a very large Precambrian basement high and a very large horst structure. So what we're seeing here is that we need to identify, when it comes to understanding the Cambrian, you need a lot of seismic. The only way to know what you're looking for, like if you're oil and gas exploration, obviously you're shooting seismic to look for horst blocks. But if you're going to look for carbon capture targets, you're going to look for grabens. So a lot of seismic to be able to pinpoint where these faults are and what size your graben might be, that sort of thing. Now, another thing I wanted to do is I wanted to look at the dip of the rocks into the Appalachian Basin. So I did stratigraphic cross sections for this. But again, once you flatten it on the Shadow Lake Shale and you annotate it with your unconformity between your Middle Ordovician and your Cambrian, you got your transgressive event that separates the Eau Claire from your Mount Simon, and you start correlating. Well, the well to the north, further up towards the Algonquin Arch, obviously we have Eau Claire units that are much thinner than what we're seeing down here by the shoreline, and they thicken and deepen quite quickly into offshore Lake Erie. And here we're picking up some Mount Simon, and here we're picking up a lot of Mount Simon down to the Precambrian basement. And again, I fully annotated these for your edification with water, porosity, where it was reported, and that nature. So again, if you were to look at this from a carbon capture point of view, you're looking at a deep saline aquifer offshore Lake Erie with a lot more porosity in the bottom of the Eau Claire and Mount Simon. They report this as being water wet, but this, I mean, obviously it's a very old log. It's not very good for using for this purpose, but you can see that, you know, the water and the porosity is actually coming up section, and we have water shows noted in here. The porosity is probably not very good, but we're seeing that porosity does come across and moves up dip towards the Algonquin Arch. So the main purpose of this was to calculate the dip of the sediments into the basin, and I did that between the wells and across the entire transect. What we basically find is the dip of the rocks here is about 7 meters per kilometer, and it correlates very well with the regional dip that's been proposed in the past. But we really don't know if there's structure in here causing any of that to, you know, interfere with our interpretation. And again, the only way to decipher that is you're going to have to shoot a lot of seismic. All right, let's get to the fun part. This is the core, so this is what you all guys came to see. But I'm going to go through and point out some of the classic textures and fabrics and things you're going to notice in the core that are very important because they give us an idea of how they were deposited, under what conditions they were deposited, and give us some clues also to its early burial history. So here we have planar beds. These are just flat-lying beds. On the right, you've got this glauconitic one. You know, this might be in a glauconitic shoal of some kind, indicative of slightly lower energy environments and maybe slightly deeper waters. Okay, so over here we have ripples. Ripples are inclined layers. They occur in slightly more energetic environments or slightly shallower waters. So you can see the inclined layers as it rotates around. You see the inclination of the beds. So that's kind of cool. So this is maybe something that's, you know, in slightly more energetic waters, still pretty shallow because we're depositing sands, right? And here we have inclined crossbeds. So this one on the right, so the one on the right is spinning for you. You can see the beautiful, like it's inclined beds, cross-bedded with these planar beds. So this may be indicative of dune. And once you understand where a dune is deposited, you can start doing it, depositional environment interpretations. And this is kind of important to a geologist to understand, you know, from one environment am I going to the next? And then you can start coming up with, you know, proving up your transgressive sequences, but also looking at the stacking of these depositional cycles. And here we have some great examples of hummocky cross stratification. This is really kind of cool. They are basically inclined layers, declined layers, sandwiching some sediments in the middle. And you can see it on both sides. And actually what we're seeing here is we're seeing inclined layers and declined layers going in opposite directions. Okay, so I talked about the fact that we probably had sedimentary faulting that controlled some of the deposition of these sediments, and especially the thickening of the sediments. So you have to start going back to the core and you say, okay, well, can I actually prove that this is even a possibility? So we have lots of examples of what we call thixotropic structures, including sand pillars, sand dikes, and even convolute bedding. So over on the left, we've got a small sand pillar. On the right, we've got a much larger one. And they're likely of seismic origin. Here we have an example of a sand dike. And you can see that this sandy layer has been, you know, compressed and injected, cutting through the layer above and going up. And this is likely, again, something that occurred after fault movement, maybe a significant fault movement. This is really cool. And you're going to see this in the upper part of the Eau Claire Formation. This is like a stromatolite or algal mats. These algal mats were actually lying down horizontally on a substrate. This might have been that substrate. And these things were flat lying. But something has now compressed them in an accordion-like fashion and then turned them over on their side. Now, likely this could be, you know, a very large storm or maybe some very large seismic event. Both are possible. All right, so we also have examples of flooding surfaces. Now, flooding surfaces are very common in the core, and they mark the beginnings of my stratigraphic units, or my sedimological units. So you're going to see them marking the beginnings of like Eau Claire 1, Eau Claire 2, those sorts of things. And basically what they are is, you know, we have deeper water strata being overlain by shallower water strata, and this marks the beginning of a fining upward sequence. This is a blow-up of that transgressive event that I'm talking about that separates the Eau Claire above from the Mount Simon below. This is, you see these deeper water carbonates that sandwich this very nice deeper water shale. I found it in all the cores, even at Clearville and other places. And it's a very nice marker bed. And you can, once you get the log signature for it, it's very consistent. And we can correlate that over large distances. Okay, this is a blow up of the unconformity that separates the Middle Ordovician from the Cambrian or the Eau Claire. And you can see this is a very nice erosional layer. It's been beveled out. And again, we have very different rock types across here. This was an erosional event that lasted a long time. We also have these, what we call short-lived erosional units, intra-unit erosional surfaces. So we have a slightly deeper water carbonate overlain by a sandy carbonate. And you can see that this layer has been heavily chewed up or beveled. And there's even pieces of that layer sitting above it, showing you that it was an erosional surface. The next bit of mapping I'm going to show you, again, we have our reference well up here. We have the isopack contours for the Eau Claire Formation in purple, the Mount Simon in light blue. Now, I do have to make a comment. If you notice, the 12159, this, if you look at these contours, I would say there's no Mount Simon there, but there is Mount Simon, right? So again, this is data generated in OPDS. OPDS needs to be kind of updated and modernized and homogenized. But there's two things I want you to notice. First of all, if you take a spot here on the zero contour for the Cambrian, and you went straight to the southeast towards that reference well we're looking at today, you see that the overall thickening of the sediments is quite quick. And if you take that same point and you go due south, well, it's not quite as quick. So something interesting is going on over here. So I decided to put the bathymetry layer back on in Google Earth. And here's something very interesting. You see that the bottom of the lake is increasing in depth very quickly in the same spot where we have this thickening in the Cambrian. I don't think that's a coincidence. Okay, this is the last part of my talk. This is of the Clearville oil pool. Now, the best thing that we can do is have high density core with logs. We get an opportunity to study the core, interpret them, interpret the depositional facies, and come up with actual facies, which is fantastic. So these are 3 wells going from the west side to the east side of Clearville. This is a stratigraphic cross-section hung on the Shadow Lake Shale. Once I got my unconformity in there, I found my transgressive event, which is kind of cool. What can you learn from this? Okay, core is outlined in gray, so you can see where they took the cores. I've marked on here the porosity and oil and gas shows, so I have that there too. So what you see quickly is that it looks like the Middle Ordovician sediments, everything above this unconformity, is thickening rapidly to the east. And the units over here, these wells aren't that far apart. The units don't correlate very well. Again, when you're so close to each other, I mean, these rocks shouldn't be, they should be pretty flat lying for the most part, right? They're not going to be up and down or mountainous or anything. So when they don't correlate very well with each other, obviously there's some sort of structural input. We're going to see that much more here in this next section. This is a structural cross-section on a structural datum. And now you can start to see more. This is fantastic. So going from the west side of Clearville to the east side, now we see that this is a horst block stepping up to the east. This is very cool, right? And it starts to explain the differences that we're seeing in the reservoir development. On the west side, the reservoir is not very good here, and it was non-productive. Oil coming out of the Middle Ordovician, top of the Cambrian in the middle, and the eastern block, oil and gas coming out of just the Middle Ordovician section. And you can see the porosity is actually climbing higher across here. And again, it's confirming that there has to be some faults in here because the rocks are offset from each other. So the faults also, are partly responsible for the difference we're seeing in the reservoir development. But it's not really telling me anything about the Cambrian that I really want to know. It's not as clear. I think maybe the Cambrian's doing something in this direction, but I'm not sure. Now, before I get to that next section, I want to show you a seismic section that I acquired with West Bay Exploration back in the day. My good buddy Al Lever over there has helped me out with this one, which is kind of cool. But West Bay, when we shot seismic across Highway 3 across Clearville, because we were looking for Cambrian, here's what we found, okay? I'll just start at the bottom and work my way up. This is your Cambrian reflector here. This is your Ordovician reflector. This is the Rochester. You can see your B salt. You got a nice B salt, and the B salt is gone after this fault. Now, this is my interpretation of the faulting, so take it with a grain of salt. This is the Dundee reflector. Matter of fact, wells that drilled up in here through the west side of Clearville and through the Dundee produced oil both here and here. It's kind of fun. Okay, so what do we notice? Okay, we got our nice big faults giving us our structure down here at the Cambrian, but wait a sec. The Cambrian's tilting up to the west. The geology just told us it was tilting up to the east. Well, it was Mr. Lever over there who shot his own seismic across here. And when he did, he told me, he goes, Ian, there's something to do with this shallow seismic signals. And when he flattened on the Rochester, all of a sudden, we had our stair step up to the east again. So when you're shooting seismic over structures like this, it can be complicated. There could be things going on up in the shallow part of the section that could give you an erroneous feeling for what's going on down here. Anyway, back to this last cross-section. This was a cross-section I did at Clearville because I still felt like I'm still missing a piece of the puzzle here. So I flattened it on the unconformity that separates the Middle Ordovician from the Cambrian. And here's what we find out. Again, we're seeing the stair step up to the east with the fault blocks, a thickening of the Middle Ordovician to the east, but now we're starting to see that we're seeing a thickening of the Cambrian to the west. So what's that telling us? It's telling us that before the unconformity, during deposition of the Cambrian, and before the unconformity, there was some structural tilting of Clearville to the west. After the unconformity, there might have been a period of uplift erosion, all that kind of good stuff. And then deposition of the Middle Ordovician. Well, it looks like Clearville might have been tilting to the east. So there's a lot going on. The Cambrian is not just it was a very busy time. The basin was not static. It was forming, and it controlled what went on during the development of these kind of structures, which are the Cambrian structures. Now, the last thing I'll show you, this is just something I came up with, and it was with working with the library that really helped. Back in the day when I was working with West Bay, I did all these cross-sectional ribbons through southwestern Ontario, and it gave me the ability to put together what I call a facies distribution model. So during the Cambrian, around the time of just before the erosional event, this is what it looked like. This is where Willie would have been, and this is where Clearville would have been. Clearville was along this platform margin. This is a shot where just before the deposition of the Shadow Lake, here you go, Clearville, you got your unconformity in there, you got the Middle Ordovician sediments. But Willie's in here. Willie, we're seeing like upper and lower shore face sands, maybe some beach sands. And in Clearville, we're seeing outer platform margin, we're seeing reefal margin, and we're seeing inner margin kind of sediments. Why is this important? Well, again, by studying the small oil pools and studying them in detail, we get to learn something about how the Cambrian came to be, right? So what's next? What's next is I want to take what we think we learned about the Cambrian sediments on Eastern Lake Erie, most importantly, start to apply, like for this core in particular, I want to start applying depositional environments to it. But I want to take their log signatures for the Eau Claire and the Mount Simon. I want to bring them all the way southwest, just like Al Phillips is doing. He's correlating everything from one side of Lake Erie to the other. And it's going to be important because out towards southeast Michigan, carbon capture and storage projects are going to go forward a lot quicker than they are going to go forward here. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and thank you for your time today.
Because he was